This is The American Revolution, A Revolution in Irregular Warfare by Daniel Smithy. The thesis statement for this presentation is, the American Revolution marked a turning point in military history by proving how guerrilla warfare could play a modern role in the resisting of a superior force, influencing the development of irregular warfare in later conflicts. So, irregular warfare is defined as a violent struggle among state and non-state actors for legitimacy and influence over the relevant populations. And guerrilla warfare is defined as a type of unconventional warfare in which small groups of irregular military, such as rebels, partisans, paramilitary personnel, or armed civilians, use ambushes, sabotage, terrorism, raids, petty warfare, or hit-and-run tactics in a rebellion, in a violent conflict, in a war, or in civilian war to fight against regular military, police, or rival insurgent forces. Though guerrilla-style warfare can be traced back to ancient times, the American revolutionaries were the early adopters of irregular warfare in the colonial era. So we have examples of guerrilla-style warfare being fought as far back as the ancient Egyptians and during the time of Alexander the Great. But this had sort of become a lost art of war during the colonial times, where warfare had become more gentlemanly, so to speak. There were rules of war that civilized nations, especially the European powers, adhered to when they fought. During this time, warfare consisted of lines of soldiers standing across from each other, taking turns firing volleys of musket fire at one another. These battles often involved bayonet charges, sword fighting, cannon fire, and cavalry charges. This was considered proper, gentlemanly warfare. Now, most of these rules and laws were unspoken rules, unwritten rules. The Geneva Convention hadn't been ratified yet at this point. But when going up against a superior force, sometimes the only way to win is to fight in an irregular way. Because the revolutionaries could not match the British Army's might, they were forced to use unconventional tactics. So in this photo here, we see some uniformed soldiers being shot at from some men hiding behind trees wearing buckskin. So these are clearly men who aren't proper soldiers, but they're fighting against proper soldiers, not in a head-on battle, but in a guerrilla-style way of ambushing them from behind tree cover, which was something that the colonial forces often did while fighting the British, something they adopted from the Native Americans and had experience using during the French and Indian War. And these guerrilla-style tactics included hit-and-run attacks, firing from behind tree cover, ambushing supply lines, sabotaging ammunition stores, spying on the enemy, and spreading false information. In fact, even George Washington himself, who was he fought conventional style warfare, but he encouraged his soldiers to fight in unconventional ways. And he would even spread false information, leading the British to think that they were going to be in one place when they weren't, or that they were out of ammunition when they weren't, so that the British would make bad decisions based off this false information. Now, when it comes to irregular warfare in the Revolutionary War, we have two key figures. The first is Nathaniel Greene, and the second is Francis Marion. Nathaniel Greene was one of the most resourceful commanders of the American Revolutionary War, known for adopting unconventional guerrilla-style tactics in the Southern Campaign. Rather than relying on large, decisive battles, Greene emphasized mobility, surprise attacks, and strategic retreats to wear down British forces. Francis Marion, a key figure in the Southern Campaign of the American Revolutionary War, renowned for his effective use of guerrilla warfare against British forces, earning the nickname Swamp Fox. Marion operated in the swamps and forests of South Carolina, where his deep knowledge of the terrain gave him a significant advantage. An interesting fact here is, in the movie The Patriot, Mel Gibson's character is actually based on Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox. Now, he doesn't play Francis Marion in the movie. His character was just inspired by him. And these two gentlemen were able to use, effectively, guerrilla-style warfare to defeat larger British forces that they could never have taken on in a direct conflict. But by attacking their supply lines, through night attacks, sneaking around in the forest, shooting from behind tree cover, they were able to cause so much chaos and disruption amongst the British, it would actually force them to do things they didn't want to do. And Nathaniel Greene was able to force the British Army north, which they didn't want to do because they hadn't secured the South yet. So by forcing the army north prematurely, Washington was actually able to defeat them at the Battle of Yorktown. So we have proof that this irregular guerrilla-style warfare led to the victory for the Americans. And it wasn't just on the ground either. There was also irregular naval warfare. The Continental Army deployed the use of naval privateers for smuggling soldiers and supplies, as well as for hit-and-run attacks against British vessels. So they would basically pay these mercenaries that were disguised as merchant ships, just hauling goods, but they would actually, be smuggling weapons, ammunition, soldiers, and then sometimes they would roll up beside an unsuspecting British ship, fire at it, and then take off. And by the time the British ship could get into position, this smaller, faster vessel was already out of range. So it wasn't just on land, but it was on sea as well. Now, moving beyond the Revolutionary War, American warfare tactics would be seen again during the Napoleonic Wars in Europe. So right here you have a depiction of French forces in Russia. Now, we saw American-style tactics used in Russia when the French invaded. As they would march through the rough terrain and the frozen terrain of Russia, they would be constantly harassed and shot at by small groups of Russian soldiers. And they also encountered this kind of warfare during their occupation of Spain. Now, America has a long history of both using and fighting against guerrilla tactics. Some of the wars I wanted to highlight were the Mexican-American War, the Civil War, the Filipino-American War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the Afghan War. In all these wars, American soldiers both used and fought against guerrilla tactics. And when we think of it, guerrilla-style tactics, we do think of like the Viet Cong in Vietnam. But even in modern wars, like the Afghan War, there were American soldiers who disguised themselves as locals and infiltrated, villages and caves to get to the enemy. This is irregular warfare. So it's always been part of America's, military history. Now, here's a list of the sources that I use, but there's a couple here I wanted to highlight. The first is number 7. It's a book called Invisible Armies by author Max Boot. And this traces the history of guerrilla warfare all the way from ancient times to the modern day. It was an excellent read, and it really shows how important guerrilla warfare has been in human history. And the second one that I want to highlight is number 10, American Guerrillas by Thomas D. Mays. And this is much more focused. And this is specifically the history of guerrilla warfare in the United States. This starts with the French and Indian War and also